Before watching this video, I would highly suggest playing the game that we're talking about. There's a link in the description. We all know what a walking sim is by now. It's such a funny term because of how hilariously oversimplified it is, given the impression that a game is solely a simulation of walking. Obviously, we know that that's not what walking sims are about, and thankfully most of that initial reaction to the genre has faded into the background as we've seen more and more of these types of games. However, that name didn't come out of nowhere. The naming of this genre started because these games provided players with nothing to do, which made them feel like they might as well just be walking simulators. And while that label is an unfair description of these types of games, that reaction is still valid. The games don't provide a whole lot of room for the players to express themselves mechanically. All the player can really do is walk, look, and listen. I would say that a lot of the players that initially used this description of a walking sim felt what I would call a lack of agency. Upon playing these types of games, these players didn't feel like the game used them at all. They were merely reacting to things on the screen and didn't have near as much to actually do as they had experienced with other games. But there's something that evolves from this kind of lack of mechanical expression, and that's an enhanced form of listening. These games that give the player the responsibility of walking around let the player themselves discover what the game is about, and that is what the Island Capital excels at. The game is in first person. In the beginning of the game, I start on a beach with nothing around me, leading me to want to explore to see what's around the area. I find a large floating bubble that upon touching will tell me the words of someone's memory. As I'm playing, this is the only information that I have to go on. And this is what I mean by enhanced listening. I explored the beach by myself without being told what to do and come upon this bubble out of curiosity. It's all being led by me and my own desire to see what's going on in this game. Compare this to your typical in-game dialogue in other games. These dialogues can easily be skipped because the player is usually impatient and wants to get back to what they were doing in the first place. They want control. And the Island Capital, like other walking simulators, gives the player control. This game gives a really strong atmosphere to where the player can soak up every little bit of theme by exploring the island and talking to its inhabitants. The developer of the Island Capital submitted this game to me for feedback, and they mentioned this: I want players to reflect on the themes of memory and feel melancholic and intrigued. I'm looking for feedback on the writing and general structure of the game. It's still rough around the edges in a lot of places because I'm quite new to game design. Well, you could have fooled me because I think this game has some really good organic gameplay. But if I were to give feedback on the general structure of the game, I would say that although the game excels at theme and immersion, it could be a bit more direct when it comes to storytelling. I really do love the theme that's present in the game, and as I said, the way that the player is able to listen to everything with a heightened sensitivity is really great, but I think there's a reason for that sensitivity. I think it's because, well, to put it plainly, there's not a whole lot to do in this game. And as I said before, walking sims have this tendency to give the player a story through visuals and audio. However, this is an interactive medium, and thus I think the interactivity needs to do most of the communication. And there's a few things in this game that use that interactive storytelling. Some of those things include talking to the inhabitants and discovering places you want to go, like the cave. However, when we look at the motivation of why the player does anything in this game, it mainly has to do with curiosity. And before I get too far into this, I just want to say anyone can make a game for any reason, and nothing needs to have any specific way of communicating. There's plenty of games that don't use interactive storytelling that are still loved by many. This is simply my view on how to improve the storytelling in my eyes. When the player plays this game, they're mainly motivated by a curious nature, and that's not a bad thing. But what it does is makes the player play to seek out purpose. And while that can be good for a purely organic game like Minecraft, where there's no real goal, the Island Capital has a specific ending with something specific to say. And if the player is simply going through a discovery process, finding out a story that's already happened around them, then the player isn't being used in the story at all. And like I said before, this game communicates theme really well, but I think that comes at the cost of specificity. I believe that the theme is felt in this game because there's nothing specific being communicated. The player is allowed to do anything they want and thus will build a vague sense of what's happening around them rather than anything concrete. And like many walking sims before it, the Island Capital gives the player a sense of responsibility that can only go so far. The story and themes that take place in the world don't include the player in any way. And because of that, the player doesn't feel like they're a part of the story, just a listener. And as I've said before, that is fine, but it's not interactive storytelling. To increase the amount of player agency and story-driven motivation, I would increase the amount of feedback that the player can get from interacting with the environment. This feedback is a way of acknowledging the player's decisions and makes them feel like they have actual agency in the game. There's 2 parts in the game that I felt like this really worked. One of these parts was going inside the cave, where I felt like there might be consequences to the actions of going against what the sign told me. This gave me a sense of actual impact on the world. I did something that had concrete consequences. There was also the part of talking to the fisherman, where he said my name. That made me feel weird and connected to the game in like this eerie sort of way. It made me feel like I should have been paying more attention to the fisherman and that perhaps he has a much more important role in the story. I would say that if you want the player to feel more directly involved with the theme and move them emotionally, you want to give them more feedback on specific actions. Just as the game Galaga awards players points for destroying aliens, you should award the player purpose for their actions. For example, depending on what you want to do with the story in this game, we could go many different ways with any specific action from the player. Let's take the action of reading a memory. The player could take that memory as an object, metaphorically taking the burden of someone else's anxiety. The player could later be asked to recall information from the memories, either making a point of negligence when the player doesn't recall the information, or making a point of empathy when they do recall. The player could use the memories as a way to find out where to go next. What these actions are is completely up to you, but like I said before, think about the times that the player feels directly connected to the game. Decide on what happens after the player does something, and make it related to the theme. I went through the cave, it collapsed. What happens if the player talks to someone? What happens if the player reads a memory? What happens if the player picks up trash? These are all things that you could give the player feedback on, and give them a sense of the impact on the game world. If you're a developer and you have a game that specifically tells a story, you can submit it to me for feedback. You can go to gamesover.coffee and submit your game there. My name is Devon. Thank you so much for watching. If you'd like to support the channel, you can go to gamesover.coffee.